On a hot summer night in 1988, Jane Borowski was stabbed 27 times by an unknown man. She was 7 months pregnant.
My name is Jane Borowski. I survived, and I remember everything.
Jane is the lone survivor of a serial killer. I'm your host, Jennifer Amell, and this is Dark Valley. Join us in our search for America's unknown serial killer. Subscribe to Dark Valley. Out now.
Slow Burn Media, an evergreen podcast, presents Who Killed, a podcast that provides a voice for the voiceless.
Suffolk County investigators have been searching for evidence since 10 bodies were found on the beach starting in December of 2010.
Right now, based on the common denominators, the similarities of the victims, where they were dumped, the dismemberment, it looks like one person.
We have some breaking news. CBS News has confirmed police have a suspect in custody linked to New York's 2010 infamous Gilgo Beach murders. Authorities were reportedly on the scene earlier today at First Avenue and Massapequa Park on December 11th, 2010. The first of what ended up being a total of 10 bodies was found. So we're going to have more information as we get it on this developing story.
Suffolk County Police will share new information in their investigation into the unsolved murders on Gilgo Beach. Suffolk County investigators have been searching for evidence since 10 bodies were found on the beach starting in December of 2010. Police are expected to disclose new evidence today, as well as a new initiative to share information on the cases and the new technology they're using to try to solve all those murders.
This morning, police are pouring through potential evidence they've collected from the Long Island home of Rex Huffman. Box after box removed from the crime scene. The architect and father of two has pleaded not guilty to murdering 3 young women over a decade ago. And now NBC News has learned that investigators in other states are looking into potential connections to more crimes.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Who Killed. I am your host, Bill Huffman, and this is a Slow Burn Media, evergreen podcast and killer podcast production. This week we are joined by an author, a true crime author, a very successful author, Jesse P. Pollack. He is the author of The Acid King. Welcome to the show, Jesse.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Very happy to be here.
Well, I am thrilled to have you on. I had the pleasure of meeting you yesterday through another show that we do with Evergreen on Crime Capsule, and the conversation was so captivating, I felt like we needed to continue that conversation.
You had to steal me away from Ben. It's
I stole you away from Ben for an episode.
Controversial. There's a rift in the world now.
There might be butterflies flapping. might change the whole future. Butterfly effect may happen. But what we're here to talk about actually today is the case of the Long Island serial killer. And as you guys know, I've covered this case for a long time. And Jesse actually has been a little bit closer to the investigation than I have. And why don't you give us a little bit of a background on how you got associated with this large, sprawling investigation?
Well, it was a really strange turn of events, honestly. I mean, I was familiar with the case from the moment it broke. I remember it was before I was working as a professional journalist and way before I was working on my first book. I was actually working in a hospital as a patient sitter. And the patient that I was assigned to was watching, I don't know, CNN or MSNBC, one of those at the time. And then all of a sudden, it just cut into the broadcast, like major breaking news. All of these bodies have been found along the Gilgo Parkway. And it's kind of hard for a lot of people that follow true crime media these days to kind of wrap their head around this. But in 2010, 2011, when that story broke, it was kind of a big deal because this was the biggest sort of, I guess, serial killer news probably since Dahmer. Like, things kind of came to a lull with serial killers as forensic technology was advancing and, a lot of these killers were getting caught early on and, you know, a lot of them didn't have the quote unquote like icon status as like your Dahmers and your Bundys and your Gacy's have, you know, since elevated to. So to hear on the news that there is like essentially a modern day Jack the Ripper running around on Long Island, only about 2 hours away from where I grew up in New Jersey, it was pretty startling. And for most of the people that remember the news breaking, like the updates just kept coming and kept coming. And then there was the whole saga of Shannan Gilbert, the escort who had disappeared in Oak Beach, not far away from where these bodies were found. And there was all this speculation. Is she one of these bodies? And it turned out like she wasn't. And so it became like this really weird, not just a whodunit case, but excuse me, a case of, all right, this is getting bizarre. We're on the 4th or 5th set of remains that we have tried DNA matching to Shannan, and it's not her. And the number jumped to, if not a dozen, you know, over a dozen. And then, of course, once they finally did find her in the marsh, the story just continued to get stranger and stranger. The circumstances of how her body ended up there, the state of her body, the state of her personal effects, and then the linchpin that sort of led me into getting pulled into the case as no longer just an observer, but someone who was kind of working behind the scenes on it, was the issue of the now infamous 911 call. At the time that the story broke, you know, the public was aware that there was a 21-minute 911 call, but in a really, really strange turn of events, the Suffolk County Police Department was refusing to release this audio. And that made it all the more frustrating for anyone who was paying attention to the case, because at the same time, the Suffolk County Police Department was also trying to say that, no, she's completely unrelated to this, you know, serial killer case along the Parkway. But we're not going to let you listen to the tape. And it's like, well, what is it? If she was a completely unrelated event and she wasn't even murdered, it was an accident or quote unquote death by misadventure, what is the harm of releasing this 911 call? And they always fell back on, oh, well, it's an ongoing investigation and it would compromise the investigation to release this audio. Now, you know, I don't want to speak too much for motivations here because it's all speculation, but in a lot of these cases where the police do not want to release a piece of evidence, no matter how circumstantial it is or not, a lot of times the motivation behind it is, you know, we just kind of want something to go away. We don't want this to be a topic of discussion. Let's just deny the release of it and hope people forget about it. But when you deny something like that, more and more people are going to want it. And so it was like a really morbid thing, honestly. The Shannan Gilbert 911 call was kind of like the holy grail of quote unquote lost media when it came to true crime. And I was convinced that no one was ever going to hear it. You know, usually when the cops are saying for a decade, no, we're not going to release this, and they're fighting court systems and judges and you know, court orders, it's a pretty good indication that no one is ever going to hear this thing. And then, much to my surprise, a decade later, and by this point I had already published 2 books and co-directed a true crime documentary, I came across on social media a GoFundMe link that was shared by a friend of mine on Facebook. And it was something to do with Shannan's family. And I clicked on it and said, oh, what's going on here? Like, what do they need a GoFundMe for? Because they had already used a GoFundMe to bury Shannan, which is tragic in and of itself. Like, how many movies at this point have been made about Shannan Gilbert? How many television episodes have been made about her? Her family has never received any sort of financial compensation for any of those projects. They were never brought in as consultants or anything like that. And I know that for a fact from, I've since become friendly with Shannan's sister, Cherie. And that's made all the more infuriating by the fact that Peacock is going around and signing, $1 million deal with Rex Heuermann's wife, ex-wife, whatever she is. I don't know, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. But you get what I'm saying here. It's just, just seeing that this poor family who has gone through enough tragedy and has been exploited by so many entities, had to put their hands out just to bury the poor woman. And now there's another GoFundMe popping up on social media. I just had to take a look at it and go, what's going on now? What are they doing to these poor people? And basically it said, our attorney, John Ray, has finally been granted access to the recordings of Shannan's 911 call, but he is not allowed to make the tape public. He's only allowed to review it and analyze it pending a civil case that was filed against Dr. Charles Peter Hackett, who it was an Oak Beach resident who kind of inserted himself into this case under a lot of really bizarre circumstances.
Bizarre circumstances. Talk about insertion. Jeez.
Really weird guy with a really weird history. So bizarre. I could honestly go either way on it. Some of the stuff that he's done is so shady that, yeah, I could definitely see him being a serial killer. But I can also just see him as being a pathological liar who it just thrives on attention. I could go either way. Listeners, if you haven't already, I cannot recommend enough reading Lost Girls by Robert Kolker.
I was going to bring that up because we talked about that yesterday, and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's the definitive book on the case. It's a great overview on the case, even though it was written before the arrest of Heuermann. And there are several chapters that go into the bizarre history of Dr. Hackett and his connection to Shannan's disappearance and death. So that case basically opened the door for the Suffolk County PD to finally be compelled by a court order to release that recording to the Gilbert family lawyer, John Ray. Again, with the caveat, you cannot make it public. You cannot play it for anyone else other than whoever you're independently using to clean up, analyze, or transcribe the tapes. Now, the GoFundMe mentioned that they had consulted a firm in, I believe, New Jersey that was quoting the job at something like $6,000 to, analyze, clean up, and transcribe a 21-minute piece of audio. Look, I'm not against people getting paid for their work, but for Christ's sakes, hasn't this family been through enough? They're of limited means. They have never once gotten a single dime from any of the 3 movies that have been made about them, the, 25 TV specials, et cetera, et cetera. They're economically impoverished. Again, like I mentioned before, they had to rely on charity just to bury Shannan. Right. And seeing that GoFundMe, I just didn't think it was right. Again, like I don't expect this company to hand everything out for free, but come on, you can't throw them a discount or do something pro bono. But instead of just sitting there and shaking my fist at the sky, for lack of a better term, I kind of realized, well, I'm in a unique position where maybe I can do some good here. Before I became a professional journalist, I was actually a trained audio engineer. Straight out of high school, I went to the Institute of Audio Research in Manhattan because at the time I played in music groups, and I kind of thought, well, playing live music doesn't make a whole lot of money, but maybe I could make steady income as a producer or a sound engineer. So I was trained in many methods of sound editing, sound cleanup, sound restoration, etc. Skills that I utilize for doing the audio work on the documentaries that I've worked on, even podcasting. So, while I'm not on the cutting edge of audio technology, I know more about it than your average Tom, Dick, and Harry. So I just thought, you know what? They might not reply to you, but you can at least say you offered to help instead of just being, another loud member of the peanut gallery. So I sent an email to John Ray. I got his email address off of his website, basically explaining everything that I just did. So instead of just sitting there and shaking my fist at the sky, for lack of a better term, out of frustration for how wrong this family has been done, I realized, well, I might be in a unique position to help here. Before I became a professional journalist and an author and a documentarian, I actually was a trained audio engineer. Straight out of high school, I went to the Institute of Audio Research in Manhattan because when I was in high school, I played in bands, and I figured, well, if, I don't make a living as a touring or gigging musician, maybe I could make steady income as a producer or soundboard engineer or something like that. So I was trained by some of the best in the field in audio editing, audio restoration, cleaning up like old tapes and stuff like that. Skills that I still use to this day between the documentaries that I work on and podcasting. So, I wasn't under any impression oh, they're going to be running to me for this, but I just figured, well, at least I can say I did something. I tried to help instead of just saying, oh, that's a shame, and shrugging my shoulders and walking away. I had watched this family get done dirty so many times over the years that I was just I'm sick of seeing this. Let me see if I can help. So I reached out to John Ray through his website, and I pretty much explained everything the way that I did just now to him. Look, I'm a trained audio engineer. I'm also a true crime journalist. I'm familiar with the case. I know the particulars. You won't have to bring me up to speed on who is who like you would with, someone who is just in the sound world. I'm in both worlds, and I would be more than happy to help you out with this, and I would not charge a dime. And he reached out to me the next day, and he said, can you take a phone call? So we got on the phone and we talked for a couple hours. He explained the situation to me and essentially said, what we are looking for is, under all of the, audible noise, the hiss, the static, all the stuff from this low fidelity recording of a telephone call, are there other voices in the house other than Shannan, her driver, Michael Pack, and the John who called her to his home, Joseph Brewer? And he also wanted to know if we could find any evidence that the tape had been doctored in any way, like any evidence that, some portions of audio had been snipped out. Because again, the Suffolk County Police Department held this tape for nearly a decade. I want to say it was 9 years. And he was understandably concerned, they had all this time to scrub this tape of anything that may look bad on them. He wanted to know if it had been doctored. And I said, I won't know what I can do until I hear the recording, but I have been trained to look for things like that. I'll let you know what I can do. And he thought about it for a little bit, and he said, well, you know what? The worst that can happen is you don't provide the results that we're hoping for, and we take it to someone else. So, yeah, let's give it a shot. So he had me sign an NDA because, again, this tape was not for public consumption, and he allowed me to put a team together. It was very important to me, especially as someone that was, again, already familiar with this case, to not have any sort of confirmation biases cloud my judgment on anything. So I assembled a small team with two other professionals in the world of true crime and audio engineering and law enforcement. The two gentlemen that I worked with, well, the first one was a gentleman by the name of Michael Whelan, who some of your listeners may recognize as the host of the Unresolved podcast. Michael has been covering the Long Island serial killer case since 2015. He and I interviewed Robert Kulker back in 2018 about a series of developments in the case, I believe with DNA technology. And, I knew that, like me, he knew the particulars of this story, but he also knew a lot about audio engineering because Michael produces his own show. And then to round out this small team, we brought in a friend and fellow podcaster of ours who was trained in the other side of a situation like this, a gentleman by the name of Jeff Adamick. who is the host of the Changing Hearts and Minds podcast. And what makes Jeff unique as a podcaster and someone who would be working with us on an audio engineering project like this is Jeff was law enforcement. He was in the military. He was trained at Quantico by the FBI. He took courses from John Douglas. And he also works in computer systems and security. So not only was he familiar with the case as a true crime guy and as a podcaster and, just someone who follows the news, he also has the training of an FBI personnel, essentially, and also has all of the computer background work, which came in very handy because John Ray, God love him, he couldn't figure out how to get the digital file of the 911 call off of his iPhone, and Jeff ended up, walking him through it, and we got that situation sorted out. So again, I had this team of 3 people, including myself, that could bring all of our collective experience to the table, fact check each other's work. Like, if you have a situation where it's like, I think I hear them saying this word, but what do you think? You got 3 sets of ears to go back and forth on, and that was incredibly useful. And
Right.
we spent about 3 months working on that tape, and I mean, it was a very surreal experience. This was a tape that I honestly never in a million years thought I was going to hear. Like I said, when you have a police department keeping something that close to the chest for nearly a decade, usually a good sign it's never coming out. Mm-hmm. And then one day in July 2020, there I am sitting in my home studio with my headphones on, listening to again, what was dubbed at the time, the holy grail of true crime lost media. And it's a chilling recording. I mean, it's public now, and that's the only reason I can talk about this. Now that phone call has been made public in the last year by Suffolk County, the NDA for that portion of the evidence that I worked on with John Ray is void. So, I mean, I'm sure many of your listeners have heard that tape. It's chilling. And long story short, we ran it through several processors. We even used some artificial intelligence to help clean up a lot of the noise in the background. We used a series of compressors and filters to basically try and make the human voices as clear as possible on that recording and see if there are any, again, like John Ray asked for, if there were any voices hidden on there. I mean, I didn't hear anything like that sounded like it was a fourth party. Everything sounded like it was Shannan Gilbert and Michael Pack and Joe Brewer. But of course, since it's just audio and you don't have a visual element to go with it, that's just interpretation, not stone cold fact. But there were things that jumped out about that tape to us.
Okay.
Mostly just, there's really no way to say this, how full of shit the Suffolk County Police Department was about the contents of that tape. For 9 years, they all, oh my gosh, she was hysterical. She was out of her mind. She was clearly hopped up on drugs and having a mental break and all this stuff. And she was nonsensical. She had no idea.
That was definitely the narrative.
Yeah, exactly. 100% controlling the narrative because, I mean, I can't say because, like, I have some sort of insider intel for their motivations here, but I'm sorry, that whole case reeked of the cops just didn't want to do anything with it. Oh no, it was just like the Jeanette De Palma story that I chronicled in my first book, Death on the Devil's Teeth. It was just some stupid young woman who took too many drugs and went outside and died. They always like to say that too. Shannan succumbed to the elements.
Yes.
What elements?
It's Jersey. I mean, it
was Long Island. Yeah,
I know it's Long Island, but I mean, it's not like this is the mountains or the desert or where wild animals are going to come and.
Oh yeah, it was early. It was the first week of May. I mean, one of the things that we did while preparing our supplemental report for John was just basically go through all of the established particulars of the case. we reviewed both of her autopsy reports, the one that Suffolk County prepared and the one that Dr. Michael Bodden prepared for the family independently. And we were checking everything from the tide reports, the weather reports, all of this stuff. The time that Shannan's phone call ends, and she did not die as soon as the phone line disconnected. I mean, I'm pretty sure we all can agree on that. The sun was coming up. It was something like 55 degrees out. And as far as, because some people have speculated, like, well, she was in a marsh. She probably fell and got stuck and drowned. People can drown in 6 inches of water. It was like a third of an inch of water was what was reported for that day. And I mean, this is where stuff gets kind of tricky. I won't say their name because this has to do with their employment and I don't want to blow up their spot, but I have spoken with someone close to the situation regarding the recovery effort for finding her body, and what they told me was their staff, we'll put it this way, their staff said that she was found pretty much sitting up. So you don't drown sitting up, leaning against a shrub, and you don't freeze to death when it's 55 degrees out in the middle of May. So what elements did Shannan Gilbert succumb to? And when you ask the Suffolk County PD that, they go, I don't know. And then they treat you like an asshole if you go, well, what do you mean you don't know? They have gaslit Shannan Gilbert's family. They've straight up lied about her. Like, I'll never forget the press conference when they released that 911 call where a reporter had asked about some of these issues that I'm talking about right now. And whoever they had up at the podium at the time was just like, oh, well, we understand from the family that, she had a history of bipolar and, she would have episodes where she wasn't in touch with reality or something. So that's probably what happened. I've talked to Cherie many times about this. Again, Cherie is Shannan's sister. She told me, yes, Shannan had bipolar disorder, but she did not have delusions. She had mood swings, but she did not have episodes where she was not in touch with reality. She didn't hallucinate. She didn't have, paranoid delusions or anything like that. She said it was a total mischaracterization. My family never told them that. They are pulling that out of their ass. And they've been called out on this many times, and the Suffolk County PD never, ever, corrects the record on it. And again, if she's just some call girl, quote unquote, who, they were trying to say everything from, oh, well, she probably did some coke with her client and freaked out and died. But, when they tested her hair at her autopsy, it came back negative for all drugs. So there went that theory. But, again, if she's just some nobody who, quote unquote, succumbed to the elements in a marsh where coincidentally a serial killer is using it as his dumping ground, then why are the police lying about so much? Why do they mischaracterize Shannan? Why did they lie about what's on the tape? Because again, she was hysterical on it. Yeah, she's agitated on the tape, but she knows where she is. She does not seem to remember the house number or anything like that, but she's just like, I'm near Jones Beach, and she was. And, she was answering questions, she was lucid, but she definitely seemed to be very fearful. And fearful of what would happen to her once she leaves Brewer's house. Now, Brewer just wanted her gone. You can hear on the recording, he's trying to get her out of there. But again, that's another weird thing with this case, because it's never really been definitively established what happened in that home that led Shannan to freak out and call 911 and feel like someone was going to kill her. It's never been established if Brewer threatened her in some way. There have been some innuendos over the years that supposedly Brewer had suspicions that that Shannan was supposedly assigned male at birth and was a trans woman, which I'm not even going to get into innuendos like that. It's just so stupid. It's not even worth examining.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah. And that's supposedly, him questioning her on that led her to freak out. Just weird shit like that. So that's another kind of murky gray area in this already bizarre story. But again, she is afraid of what is going to happen to her when she leaves the house. And when you listen to the tape, something does happen to her when she finally does leave Brewer's home. I think it's about 17 or 18 minutes into this 21-minute phone call.
What's going on, by the way, like with Brewer during this 17 minutes that she's still in the home, if she's supposedly so hysterical and whatnot? What is his reaction? Is he heard in the background?
He's heard several times. Basically, the phone call starts out, Shannan is sitting behind a couch in his living room on the second floor of his house. She's like basically sort of hiding behind the couch, essentially. And you can tell Brewer knows that she's on the phone with the cops because he's doing that like firm but I'm reasonable kind of voice, like, okay, come on, it's time to leave, like that kind of thing. Like he knows he's being monitored by law enforcement by this point, so he's not being too forceful. He's not trying to grab at her or anything on the tape, as far as I remember. I might double check that afterwards. I don't think it's established if he touches her, but he's basically in and out for the first 10 minutes of the tape. Sometimes he disappears for a minute or two. Sometimes he reappears and she's like, all right, no, you need to go. Look, your driver's here. Because at one point during the tape, Shannon's driver, Michael Pack, enters the home. And this is where things get interesting. The first part of what happens in this ordeal, Pack has been pretty honest about. I saw there was an issue in the home. I went in and, Shannon's hiding behind a couch. And at one point I thought she was faking it. So I asked her if she'd ever seen the movie Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Because there's like kind of like a similar scene in that movie where Johnny Depp playing Dr. Hunter S. Thompson's like freaking out and hiding in a room.
Yes.
So...
Great scene.
And you do hear that on the tape, and he says something like, it's just like that movie, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, right? And she's like confused by what he means by it. She's like, huh? And so he's pretty honest about that. But eventually, there comes a point in the tape where Michael and Joseph get frustrated, and they both leave. Pack ostensibly goes back to his car, which is parked outside. Not sure where Joseph walked off to. Joseph told a strange story to either the police, the media, or both, where he claimed, oh yeah, she eventually left my house when I found her hiding in one of my bathrooms and I scared her out. That's not on the tape. On the tape, you hear them both leave. She's still on the line with 911. Things get really quiet for a couple minutes, and you can hear her moving around in what sounds like a bathroom. There's a lot of reverb in it, like you would like with tile in a room. And you hear her leave the room, and she starts kind of like slowly moving around the house. You can hear the rhythm in her footsteps. Like it seems like she's like looking around, like where is everybody, or like is the coast clear kind of thing. And she eventually feels comfortable enough to leave the house. She leaves the house of her own volition. She does not leave the house scared off by Joseph Brewer, as he has said over the years.
All right, Jesse, we are back, and we'll just call that a little sponsor break.
Yes, a word from our lovely sponsors.
Absolutely. So the way
you
we
ever
left
get weird
off,
ones?
Maybe some gold and silver ads every once in a while.
Oh man, my podcast, small plug here. I've got two that I work on now that Devil's Teeth came to a close. True Crime Movie Club, where we review these awful bargain barrel true crime movies, and Podcast 1289, which is a roundtable comedy podcast where we lampoon like bizarre conspiracy theories, goofy paranormal stories, some ridiculous true crime, if you will. We go through Spreaker, who we love. Spreaker rules. They've been very, very good to us. But occasionally, because of whatever algorithm is at play, and it's a region-based algorithm, you will get some very bizarre ads on our show. and like sometimes you'll get like Guatemalan McDonald's ads or stuff like that, or like marital aids. And we always joke about that every time it happens. We're like, yeah, the English speaking world is done with our shit. Or, people only the dildo companies want something to do with us this week. So it's always very funny. Can we say dildo on this show?
Yeah, of course you can. I mean, it's been brought up as, been found at crime scenes and stuff before.
Oh, like in Arthur Lee Allen's trailer.
This is true. And then there was also one in the Colonial Parkway murders.
That's right.
Bill Thomas has been on a few times, and that case is crazy.
It is. Another small plug, Michael Whelan, who I mentioned earlier, who worked on the tape with me, and frequent guest, host on the aforementioned podcasts. He did a multi-episode series on those murders as well, which is really good. So listeners, if you haven't checked that out, definitely check out Unresolved, another quality podcast like the one you're listening to. But back to the story here. Yeah, so the interesting thing about what happens next on the tape is, for years, Joseph Brewer told either the police, the press, or both that, oh, no, Shannan left my house because I found her hiding in a bathroom and I scared her out. I think he said he opened the door and jumped, like, boo. And that's what finally got her to leave. But that's not on the tape. The tape definitely seems to suggest that she is hiding in a bathroom at one point. You can hear that kind of reverberation that comes from a room with a tile floor, or at the very least tile on the walls. But no one ever enters that room. She eventually notices the house gets quiet. Pack has since gone outside, not sure where Brewer goes off to. And you can hear her leave the bathroom, and the kind of rhythm of her footsteps indicate that she's kind of like, I don't want to say creeping, like in a negative connotation, but that kind of like you're walking around a house to see if anyone's like going to, dart out from behind a corner or something like that.
Peering around the corners and sort of moving slowly, just checking your environment, basically.
Yeah, there definitely seems to be a clear intent that she is looking for something, or looking to see if someone is hiding somewhere. And eventually she notices the coast is clear, and finally gets up the nerve to go outside, which, as we mentioned before, she seemed very, very fearful of. And the police always framed it as inexplicable, like, oh, we don't understand why, she refused to leave the house. And she clearly says on the tape to Michael, Pack, her driver, who's like telling her, come on, let's go back home. She's like, what's going to happen to me? She keeps saying that. What's going to happen to me when I go outside? And it's clear she's afraid of him. The reasons for which are never really made clear, but those suspicions are kind of vindicated by what happens next. Because you hear her go out the door, you hear her run down the steps of the, it's like, the whole layout of the house is weird. It's like a two-story home, but what would be the first story on most homes is like the first story. And, the actual first story of the house is like a basement. So to get to the first floor of the house, you have to go up like 30 feet of stairs. And Michael Pack, the way that he always told this to the press and to the police was, oh yeah, I was sitting in my car waiting for her to come out, and I noticed she ran out and she fell down the steps and then just ran past my car. And I stuck my head out the window and kept shouting for her, and she wouldn't get in the car, and like I started my car and I was following her, shouting her name, begging for her to get in the car, and she just kept running. That's not on the tape. On the tape, she runs down those steps, doesn't fall. There's no incident on the steps. It's when she gets to the bottom of the steps, there is a confrontation. You can hear what I can best describe as a scuffle. It sounds like Michael Pack, he says something to her. God, I wish I had the transcript in front of me. I'm embarrassed of this right now. he says, hold on, let me just pull this up really quick because this is important. And I'm sure the transcript.
No, this is great. This is great podcasting. Everybody loves it when we do like a deep dive into the visuals that they can't see.
Yeah, right. We can always edit this.
Trust me. No, I find it actually somewhat endearing to some of these shows.
It shows that we're not like full of ourselves as experts. It's like, yeah, hold on, let me Google that real quick. There we go.
Yeah, and it's not like experts. Let's be honest. People that are experts, they're sitting there looking at their phone too. They have to have fact checks. It's just a part of getting it right, like you said. Like you wanted to do this tape right. And that's why you spent 3 months on it.
And it's one of those things, too. It's like we spent so much time on it that once we were done with it, we kind of needed to take a breather and step back. I mean, our work was done with the case anyway, but we really needed to like take a step back from the case. When something this dark kind of takes front and center stage in your life for that amount of time, it's like I need to kind of reset. So while a lot of this stuff has been very easy coming to memory, other stuff, it's like, what was the exact wording here? I don't want to paraphrase on something like that. So yeah, it's
absolutely understand.
I probably should have pulled this up beforehand, but
I
thought my memory wasn't going to fail me. I'm getting older. I'm not the young, scrappy true crime writer I once was. Now I'm just a regular schlub in his mid-30s.
Yeah, aren't we all?
Let's see here. And by the way, listeners, if you would like to read the transcript, I'm scrolling through myself right now. You can find it at unresolved.me/LISK. That's LISK. That's just a regular dash. Yeah, dash update. Again, that's unresolved.me/LISK-update. There is our full transcript.
Yeah, and I'll put a link in the show notes as well, so people can reach it.
Yeah, because once that tape was made public, we were like, all right, let's be as transparent as possible and just release all of our data and whatever people do with it, it's up to them. Again, it was always the mission statement, I guess if you could call it that, of let's try and do some good. Let's see if we can help, and whatever happens. Like we weren't arrogant enough to think maybe we're going to finally solve what happened to her. It's like, no, we're going to do our little bit of work here where we're needed. And then hopefully, people who are much better equipped with these matters will take our data and add it to the pile of raw materials that'll hopefully eventually result in a conclusion here. So my fingers are still crossed for that, but I'd be lying if I didn't say I'm pretty disheartened by the way that the Suffolk County PD is treating the investigation or lack thereof into Shannan's death. But
let's just take a little tangent on the Suffolk County Police Department.
Sure.
I mean, James Burke was basically an impediment to this investigation.
Oh, yeah.
He purposely blocked out the FBI and all the different resources that could have been there, and he just kind of stonewalled this super weird body field. Mm-hmm. I mean, basically, this was like a dumping ground for a serial killer, and yet they didn't want to try to find the serial killer. And again, I've had Maggie Freeling on before, and she thought Burke was a great suspect. Because,
so did I. He was my number one for years.
Yeah, and he was number one for a lot of people because... Why was he number one for you? Because of what? The police, knowing the police stuff, right? And
for me, it was all of the clear evasive tactics that, and this was just the stuff that was publicly released, that we knew what he was doing. The stuff with the burner phones, the evasion of certain cell phone towers, the whole like. Well, now we know a little bit more context. At the time, him making those calls in Times Square was framed as, oh, he's going to Times Square because it's a heavily populated place and it'll render security cameras absolutely useless because there's thousands of people walking around at any given second in Times Square with a phone up to their ear. Well, now we know it's because Rex Heuermann, worked in the vicinity of Times Square. You know what I mean? So, right. But at the time when that information was framed that way, it was, whoever is doing this is either a cop or someone like Ed Kemper, like a cop groupie who like knows all this stuff. This isn't stuff the average person knew about during the first decade of the 2000s. Like, you know, burner phones was something that unless you were watching The Wire or Breaking Bad every week, that wasn't something the average Tom, Dick, and Harry knew about. You know what I mean? So, like, we knew that this guy wasn't like an Ed Gein, like, you know, oh, he's got an IQ of 72 and he just can't help himself. This guy was cold, calculated, ruthless, and smart.
Yeah. I mean,
so those things led me to believe, like, this is law enforcement or someone that's incredibly familiar with law enforcement tactics.
That does beg the question of, like, do you think Burke has any connection to Rex?
No, not at all.
No, none.
No,
so it's just coincidence then.
I mean, dude, like, I have spent so much time reporting on crime in Long Island to know that two things can be true at the same time and have nothing to do with each other. Like, I spent 5 years working on The Acid King, the book and the film, about the Ricky Casso case in Long Island that happened in 1984. And, you know, some people might say, well, what does that have to do with what we're talking about today, other than, you know, it happened on Long Island? Well, I'll tell you. One of the things with the Ricky Casso case, because this was a case that was kind of dogged by, over the years, a lot of stuff got misreported. There was all the satanic panic stuff about Ricky Casso being a cult leader, and, you know, spoiler alert, he wasn't. And just like even the stuff that he did to his victim, Gary Lauwers. And one of those things that was consistently misreported over the years was, he shoved rocks down Gary Lauwers' throat. And that did not happen at all. But while I was researching the case and writing about it, I wanted to know, well, where did this rumor come from? And I found out where it did indeed where it came from. It was another case on Long Island that I think happened in '79. It was the John Pius case. Have you ever heard of that one?
I have not.
Okay, John Pius was, I want to say he was a younger teenager, 13 or 14, I think. You know what, listeners, we're going to have another endearing moment here. We are going to go back to Google here. Yes, it was 79. And let's see, he was born in...
He was only 14.
14, yeah, he was born in 65. Okay. No, he actually hadn't turned 14 yet. He was only 13. Jesus. Terrible. Yeah, and it was a very similar thing to the Casso case. He was murdered in the presence of 2 or 3 other friends, or at least peers. So here's the interesting thing there. Just like with the Ricky Casso case, the prosecution kind of lived and died by one of the witnesses to the murder becoming a state's witness. That's Albert Quinones in that case. There was one in the John Pius murder as well. Who was the teenage witness of the John Pius murder who turned state's evidence? Little kid named James Burke.
Jeez. And
when James Burke was called to testify, he came under the wing of Spoda. And Spoda, by all accounts, was the one who groomed Burke to join the police and rise through the ranks. And Spoda was often covering for Burke. So you have all of these like twists and turns and connections, but at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that James Burke killed John Pius. Yeah, he was a witness, but it was something, you know, that he was tangentially caught up in. So I believe that Burke could be tangentially also caught up in the Long Island serial killer case, in the sense that, you know, I mean, who knows? Maybe he interacted with Huerman at some point, just, you know, being a Long Island law enforcement officer. Who knows? A lot of stuff's going to come out in the wash during the trial, hopefully. But I'm not one of these people that subscribes to some of these more outlandish theories that, oh yeah, no, the night that Shannan died, there was a wild sex party at Joseph Brewer's house, and, you know, Rex Huerman was there too, and so was James Burke, and so was Spoda, and they're all covering for each other. And you know, yeah, a lot of shady shit happened in Oak Beach, but no, there was not eyes wide shut parties going on as far as my research has concluded. And I know some listeners might be disappointed to hear me express that opinion, but that's just my opinion. That's an opinion I formed.
No, I was going to say, it's also one of those things that anybody who listens to these shows knows that when you have a conspiracy of a number of individuals, the chances of it being found out is pretty good. And
they get exponentially higher.
Yeah, the chances of getting caught are that much greater. And that's why you don't see a lot of, partner killings.
Well, yeah, and that's something that I didn't get a chance to talk about with Ben over on Crime Capsule yesterday, but when we were talking about the whole, the cop theory that Jeanette De Palma, she wasn't murdered. She died of a drug overdose at a teenage party, and the kids panicked and dumped her in the woods, and they've kept it a secret for 50 plus years. Kids can't keep secrets. Like the
it's like a Harlan Coben novel.
Yeah. And my evidence for that, in my opinion, is the Ricky Casso case. Like they kept that murder a secret for 2 days. Like Casso was leading tours to the body for 3 weeks. You know what I mean? And yeah, some of the kids kept it a secret, but only because they were afraid that Casso would come and kill them. But one eventually did fess up to the police and their parents about it. And it was all in the course of under a month. So yeah, the idea that someone hasn't flipped by now about these, again, supposed, Stanley Kubrick-esque wild sex murder parties on Oak Beach, it's just, from my chair here, it just seems kind of unrealistic. It's a little too fanciful for me.
Yeah, I can't get behind any of those conspiracy theories because of the fact, there are plenty to go around in this case, but the idea that this is a group of individuals, I don't believe is possible. And like we talked about yesterday, we're talking only about Shannan at the moment. And Shannon's not even supposedly not even connected to LISK. Or to Rex, I should say.
Yeah, because we don't even know if LISK is one person, because the other thing with these not Oak Beach, with these Gilgo Beach murders / dumpings is, and this was another thing that impeded the investigation for so long, the Suffolk County Detective Bureau seems split in half, especially arguing with commissioners about this. No one seemed to be able to agree if this was one killer or two serial killers coincidentally using the same dumping ground. Like when we talked yesterday, again, this is just my opinion. As of right now, I believe that it was one killer, because when you start suggesting oh no, it was two killers, they just happen to be using the same dumping ground, that brings to my mind that meme of the two Spider-Mans in the alley pointing fingers at each other. It's just that's kind of a heavy coincidence, you know what I mean? Did they ever run into each other? Did they swap tips and tricks? Who knows?
The burlap works really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got to use the duck blind one. You can't be using potato sacks. And the burlap, that was another interesting thing too that confused a lot of people in the early days of the case too, because there was so much debate over, was there burlap or was there not burlap? Because the leak, I don't want to say leak because I don't, it implies something nefarious, but the press getting wind of the burlap came through Officer John Malia, who found some of the bodies and eventually helped recover Shannan's body. And he had mentioned in a comment to, I want to say Newsday out on Long Island, that, oh yeah, some of these remains were found in burlap. And then once that got out, I think the Suffolk County PD did not want that out initially, and there was some sort of miscommunication there. So the Suffolk County refused to confirm or deny after Malia was quoted on that. So for people whose dedication to facts kind of mattered, it was, burlap has been reported, but we can't confirm it. Meanwhile, while that conversation is going on between these camps of independent researchers and journalists and true crime aficionados and podcasters, it had never occurred to any of us well, what kind of burlap was it? Well, everybody just kind of assumed it's potato sacks or what fishermen use out on Long Island, and it turned out it was duck blind. So go figure. It was hunting burlap. It was camo.
Hey, Jesse, I can't thank you enough for joining me this week on Who Killed.
No, thank you. And yeah, you're right. This case goes deep. And we're just touching on one small yet important facet of the Long Island serial killer story, but it's one of the biggest rabbit holes that one can go down, and we only scraped the surface of what, people would consider like conspiratorial talk within a rabbit hole. It's just, I don't know, it's a very strange and fascinating and tragic story, and I'm really, really hoping that sooner than later we're going to have more answers on it and hopefully some closure, if there is such a thing, for the families that have been affected by this. But yeah, in next week's episode, we're gonna get into the real meat of things, for lack of a better term, and hopefully your listeners find it as fascinating as we do.
Thanks again, Jesse. This was awesome. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in this week, and thank you so much to Jesse for joining me and discussing this very interesting case. As you know, this is something that I've covered for a number of years, and it's something that is close to my heart. It is a voice for the voiceless, as these individuals have sort of been left by the wayside. And again, this was a discovery that happened in 2010, so to think that Rex Huerman was just arrested in this past summer is kind of wild. So next week, well, it's actually going to be in just a few hours, you will have part 2, so you can finish listening to my in-depth conversation about the Long Island serial killer with true crime author Jesse P. Pollack, and you can find his book, The Acid King, as well as many other books just by Googling his name, and that again is Jesse P. Pollack. So thanks again for listening. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can do so. It's at BillHuffman3. Otherwise, you can tune in next Friday, because that's when I drop new episodes. And as always, until next time, stay healthy and be safe.
You might be surprised to know that not all serial killers are straight, cisgender white men, and the victims of true crime are not a monolith either. She's Wendy and I'm Beth, and together we host Fruit Loops Serial Killers of Color, a true crime podcast.
Together we take deep dives into the true crime stories about marginalized and minoritized perps and victims that often go untold.
We also provide the context and nuance that these stories deserve. At Fruit Loops, we're serving up true crime with a side of history, society, culture, and some fun.
Listen to Fruit Loops Serial Killers of Color on Spotify, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
3 a.m., the comedy horror podcast that holds weekly gatherings around the campfire. Let me tell you what you're going to get. You're going to hear stories about demonic possessions, prison stabbings, skinwalkers, glitches in the Matrix, cult leaders, missing 411, night marchers, Operation Paperclip, Mesopotamian devil worship, and so many monsters it'll give Kanye West a runaway for his money. Pop and meme culture also aren't off topic. A camp where laughs and scares are constantly competing for first place. We're just a group of friends, trying to bust each other's balls, find the best stories, and expand the circle in the process. 3 a.m., the comedy horror podcast not for the faint or fragile of heart. Let's go.